The Everglades has always been a place that keeps its secrets close. 1.5 million acres of sawgrass, blackwater, and tangled mangrove, it has survived hurricanes, droughts, and decades of human interference. But over the last 30 years, something has been quietly unraveling beneath that wild green surface, and almost nobody noticed until it was too late to stop. The culprit is a snake that was never supposed to call Florida home. The Burmese python is native to the river deltas and rainforests of Southeast Asia, a region thousands of miles from the United States. It found its way into the American pet trade in the 1980s, sold in shops across the country as an exotic, low-maintenance companion. Buyers were charmed by the hatchlings, small, patterned, and easy to hold. What the sales pitch left out was the math. A Burmese python can grow to 16 feet or more, and a snake that size needs space, food, and an owner willing to handle an animal that can crush a grown man. Many buyers weren't prepared for that reality, and a number of them quietly released their pets into the canals and marshes south of Miami rather than deal with the problem. That slow trickle of abandoned pets might have stayed a minor nuisance, if not for a single night in August 1992. When Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida with catastrophic force. Among the buildings destroyed were several reptile breeding and import facilities holding large numbers of Burmese pythons. Enclosures were shredded, fences collapsed, and an unknown number of snakes simply vanished into the storm-soaked landscape. Nobody at the time understood the scale of what had just happened. The Everglades had just received an unintentional founding population of an apex predator, with no natural enemies on the continent. What followed was, in hindsight, predictable. The Everglades offered a python everything it could want: warm temperatures year-round, abundant fresh water, dense cover, and prey animals that had no evolutionary memory of a giant constrictor. Raccoons didn't flee from them. Marsh rabbits didn't recognize the danger. A female python can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a single clutch. And with no predators keeping the population in check, the snakes spread north and west from their entry point at a steady, relentless pace. The damage to native wildlife has been staggering. Multiple wildlife surveys conducted since the early 2000s have documented sharp drops in mammal sightings across python-occupied areas of the park. Raccoons, possums, bobcats, and rabbits have all but disappeared from large stretches of the Everglades that once teemed with them. Researchers who study the snake's stomach contents have cataloged dozens of different prey species, from small rodents up to full-grown deer, and, in rare but documented cases, alligators. The python isn't just an invasive species at this point. It has become the dominant force, reshaping the entire food web of South Florida. The state's first instinct was to fight numbers with numbers. In 2013, Florida launched a public hunting competition, inviting anyone with a permit to head into the swamp and bring back snakes for cash prizes and bragging rights. It generated plenty of headlines and a great deal of enthusiasm, but the actual results were modest. A few dozen pythons captured against a population that wildlife biologists believe numbers in the tens of thousands, possibly more. The state shifted toward a professional model instead, hiring contracted hunters who patrol canal levees at night, paid by the hour with bonuses tied to the size of what they bring in. It has produced real results and some genuinely enormous snakes, but it is slow, expensive, and limited by simple geography. A small number of paid hunters, however skilled, cannot meaningfully cover a wilderness the size of a small state. Frustrated by the limits of human searching, researchers began looking for help from elsewhere, first from dogs, then from something far stranger. Trained detection dogs were brought in to use scent rather than sight, since a python gives off a faint odor that humans cannot detect, but that a trained nose can pick up from yards away. The dogs performed well in trials, locating snakes that human search teams had walked past without ever noticing. But the program ran into the same wall as everything before it. There were only a handful of trained dogs available, and the swamp was simply too vast for a few canine teams to patrol effectively. It was a promising tool, not a solution. It was around this point that a team of researchers at the University of Florida decided to attack the problem from a completely different angle. Instead of searching for snakes, why not get the snakes to come to them? The idea had an uncomfortable origin. Early trials used live marsh rabbits, a python's preferred prey, placed in secure enclosures along known travel corridors. The principle worked almost immediately. Pythons that had never shown up in months of foot searches began appearing at the rabbit pens within days, drawn in by scent and movement from remarkable distances. The problem was that using live animals as bait, even unharmed ones sitting safely behind mesh, struck much of the public as cruel. The public backlash was swift, funding was pulled, and the live bait program was shut down almost as fast as it had started. But the underlying discovery couldn't be unlearned. Pythons could be lured. The question became how to do it without putting a living animal at risk. The answer that emerged from the university lab was almost absurd on paper. A mechanical rabbit. Engineers gutted plush toy rabbits and rebuilt them from the inside out, packing each one with a small motor, a battery-powered heating element tuned to mimic a rabbit's body temperature, and a scent dispenser designed to release a chemical signature close to real rabbit musk. Some units had motorized components that twitched the ears or shifted the body slightly every few seconds, simulating the kind of small movement that triggers a predator's strike instinct. Each decoy carried a hidden camera and a wireless transmitter so that researchers could monitor activity remotely without needing a human stationed at every pen around the clock. Building one of these devices wasn't cheap. By the time all the components were assembled and weatherproofed against South Florida's punishing heat and rain, the cost per unit ran into the thousands of dollars. Dozens of the decoys were placed inside protective enclosures across known python territory, with plans to scale up to well over 100 units if the early trials succeeded. The goal wasn't to harm the snakes that approached. It was to draw them into a monitored area where a capture team could move in once a python committed to the lure. For the first couple of days, it worked almost too well. Field cameras recorded large pythons approaching the decoys, drawn in by the heat and scent, coiling around the fake rabbits in the same slow, methodical strikes they would use on a real meal. Capture crews arrived on cue and removed snake after snake. The team allowed itself a brief moment of optimism, and then the program ran straight into a complication nobody had fully accounted for. The Everglades' other apex predator had taken notice. American alligators, which compete with pythons for many of the same prey species, began showing up at the decoy enclosures, drawn by the exact same combination of heat and scent that was meant to attract snakes. To an alligator hunting by feel and temperature in murky water, a heated, musk-emitting rabbit pen registered as nothing more or less than food. The first documented incident involved a large alligator crashing into a streamside pen and destroying a robotic rabbit in seconds, snapping the plastic housing and severing the transmitter mid-signal. It did not stop there. Once gators learned that the strange thermal signatures near these pens were worth investigating, the behavior spread. Within a matter of days, a meaningful fraction of the deployed units had been damaged or destroyed, some dragged into the water and never recovered. At the same time, the pythons, which are highly sensitive to the presence of a competing predator, began avoiding the same enclosures entirely, picking up on disturbed water and alligator scent and steering well clear. The decoys that had briefly seemed like a breakthrough were now caught between two predators, one tearing them apart, and the other refusing to come anywhere near them. Capture rates collapsed, and the program looked, by most outward measures, like an expensive and slightly embarrassing failure. What turned the story around wasn't a new piece of equipment. It was a closer look at data nobody had been paying attention to. Every decoy enclosure had been quietly logging far more than captures. Motion sensors, thermal cameras, and recording units had been tracking every animal that passed near a pen, not just the pythons that struck, but every creature that moved through the area, at every hour, in every kind of weather. Because the team's attention had been focused entirely on capture counts, this enormous secondary dataset had simply been piling up, mostly unexamined. When researchers finally sat down to review months of accumulated sensor logs, a pattern began to surface. Pythons weren't moving through the swamp randomly. They were following specific, repeated routes, the same corridors, at the same times of night, under similar weather conditions, again and again. Alligators showed comparable patterns of their own. What had started as a failed lure program had inadvertently produced something far more valuable: a detailed long-term map of how the Everglades' two largest predators actually moved through their territory. The team fed the accumulated sensor data into machine learning models, layering in weather records, water levels, and seasonal cycles. The resulting analysis didn't just describe where pythons had been. It began forecasting where they were likely to be at specific times, with a level of precision that traditional ground searches had never approached. Even more useful, the model suggested that python movement patterns were shaped substantially by a need to avoid alligators, explaining travel routes that had previously looked inexplicable. Armed with these predictive corridors, hunting teams stopped waiting for snakes to wander into view and started intercepting them directly along known travel paths. The shift in results was dramatic. Search teams that had once found pythons one at a time began locating multiple animals in a single outing, including, on several occasions, hidden nesting sites packed with large breeding-age females and unhatched clutches, concentrations of snakes that no amount of foot patrol or detection dog work had been able to locate. None of this erases the scale of what Florida is still up against. The python population in the Everglades remains large, and the ecosystem damage already done will take decades to even partially recover, if it recovers at all. The Robotic Rabbit program, as originally conceived, did not succeed as bait. What it left behind, almost by accident, was something more durable. A body of movement data that is now helping researchers think about the python problem less as a hunt and more as a pattern to be understood. Sometimes the most useful outcome of an experiment is not the one it was designed to produce, but the one buried in the wreckage of its failure.